All right, so Roosevelt has a mandate from the American people, and he is talking about a New Deal, the idea that if we look at the economy as a deck of cards, well, the cards are stacked against certain groups, and what we need to do is we need to have some sort of collecting of all the cards, shuffling, and then redistributing a new deal, something that's more equitable. And so what is the New Deal? What is Roosevelt positing to get the United States out of the Great Depression? It's best considered a series of laws and programs intended to end the Depression. It will have far more important long-term ramifications, however. The New Deal was designed to regulate the economy, provide for national recovery, and create a social safety net for all Americans. Now, just exactly how is Roosevelt going to do these things? The slogan of the Roosevelt administration for its New Deal programs was the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Roosevelt is going to adopt an economic theory about how to solve the Depression from someone named John Maynard Keynes. He was a British economist, and what Keynes advocated for was government spending in order to consume our way out of the Depression. There had to be some sort of entity within society that could take on debt and spur economic activity. And the only entity that John Maynard Keynes identified that had the power and scope to be able to do such a thing was government. Now, Roosevelt could not have inherited a situation more dire when he became president. The nation's banking system was so close to collapse that many state governors closed banks to avoid further withdrawals. Several states were close to filing for bankruptcy, so low had their tax base become. Now, John Maynard Keynes would be indicative of the type of individuals that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to surround himself with as he tried to figure out a way to get the country out of the Depression. He knew he wasn't the smartest man in the room, but he didn't have to be, because he had the power to collect all the smartest men and women in the country together in one room to come up with solutions to the problems that were plaguing the country. And so this leading group of intellectuals that helped Roosevelt with policy was called the Brain Trust. At this point in the nation's history, January was not the time when a president is inaugurated, so the country had to wait till March. And on March 5th, just one day after assuming the presidency, FDR is going to call Congress into special session and declare a national bank holiday for 4 days so that Congress can enact some sort of legislation to help with emergency banking relief. And that's going to be the Banking Relief Act on March 9, 1933, which establishes federal control over all banks and offers loans. I'll talk about an expansion of federal power. Here at the very beginning of the New Deal, the federal government is now assuming control over banks. And banks were only permitted to reopen if a Treasury Department inspection showed that they had sufficient cash reserves. And restoring confidence in the banking system was furthered with the Glass-Steagall Banking Act on June 16, 1933. The act regulated the size of banks and created the Federal Insurance Deposit Corporation. Now, this is an insurance that the federal government has for a particular bank backing up a depositor. So if the bank should fail, then it's going to be insured. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Each depositor insured up to at least $250,000. When the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was first created, the individual bank deposit insurance was $2,500. Then on June 16, 1934, the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to be created to regulate trading practices in stocks and bonds. The FDIC and the SEC are going to be created under the umbrella of the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. And one of the most important aspects of the Glass-Steagall Banking Act is that the legislation broke up banks in that there were banks that could engage in commercial lending, and then there would be banks that could engage in speculation on the stock market. Economists and economic historians will sometimes point to the fact that only 16% of Americans were actively invested in the stock market as a way to explain why the stock market could not be the cause or one of the causes of the Great Depression. But this fails to consider that individuals were placing their money in deposits to the bank, and then banks were then speculating with that money on the stock market. So while only 16% of Americans were, as individuals, engaged in the stock market, there were many Americans who were investing in the stock market, and they didn't even know it. because it was the bank that was using their deposits to speculate. And so the Glass-Steagall Banking Act is going to prevent that from happening. Now, Roosevelt cuts an odd figure to create so many different pieces of legislation that help the working man, considering that he came from an aristocratic background. A relative of Theodore Roosevelt, he comes from old Dutch money, but as he famously said during the New Deal, he wasn't trying to destroy capitalism, he was trying to save it. And while many Americans were concerned with this proactive executive branch, which seemed to be hell-bent on expanding federal power, Franklin Roosevelt was able to ameliorate some of the concerns of the American people, because on Sunday evening he would give what was called his fireside chats. And he began the fireside chats a week into his presidency, letting Americans know directly through the radio what his policies were, what were the comings and goings of political business in Washington, D.C., and to soothe the psyche of the American people and restore confidence to them, to their society and culture. And these fireside chats are going to have an important effect, and many Americans are going to feel that they had a personal connection with FDR. One of the key members of Roosevelt's brain trust is going to be First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She's going to really change the perceived role of the First Lady. She'll be much more politically and socially active, and Roosevelt relied on her, particularly with outreach to the African American community. And an important byproduct of the New Deal was a major political realignment. African Americans, who had before been one of the most loyal members of the Republican Party, during the New Deal, are going to switch and join the Democratic Party. And that political realignment is going to have a major effect on the country. And African Americans are going to stay within the umbrella of the Democratic Party ever since. With Congress hard at work on banking reform and legislation, Roosevelt then pivoted to dealing with relief. There were many Americans who are out of work and are feeling a sense of hopelessness about the system. Roosevelt turned to them next to provide them with relief. Even before Roosevelt took office on February 20th, 1933, Congress is going to repeal prohibition, ending the 18th Amendment and replacing it with legalizing the consumption of alcohol once again. That's going to be ratified on December 5th, 1933. There was an economic component to this as well. One of the arguments that was made for prohibition was that with less money being spent on alcoholic beverages, there'd be more money in household budgets to invest in the stock market or savings or in consumer products. But actually, the prohibition had the opposite effect. People were less likely to go out and spend their money in an entertainment capacity. There were many restaurants and bars that closed down. There were many breweries and barrel makers that went out of business, to the point where it had a significant effect. And so the idea was, if we repeal prohibition, we're going to jumpstart that whole entertainment aspect of our economy once again. Now, repealing prohibition is one thing, but generating economic activity and getting Americans back to work is quite a different story. So Roosevelt is going to act aggressively on this front. Roosevelt is going to create the Civilian Conservation Corps on April 5th, 1933. And unlike some of the other New Deal programs that we will examine, the Civilian Conservation Corps is not developed via legislation through Congress. This is an executive order, the same mechanism that Roosevelt was going to use to take the country off of the gold standard. This is worrying people. The idea that with an executive order, a president is, in the absence of legislation from Congress, going to shape policy. If Congress should ever legislate in the areas that fall under the aegis of the president's executive order, then the executive order would be trumped. In the Civilian Conservation Corps, and another program called the Civil Works Administration, they are created with the idea of enlisting unemployed men in building and repairing works. This is filling potholes, building bridges, planting trees, and we will examine the Civilian Conservation Corps and the work that it did in more detail later on in this lecture. On May 12, 1933, Roosevelt is going to sign into law the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And this was absolutely necessary because Hoover's idea that local government and private charities could handle the lion's share of providing assistance for unemployed workers was shown to be false. We needed some sort of federal government program to handle this. And Roosevelt will tap a New York social worker named Harry Hopkins to run the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. But Hopkins and Roosevelt were just like Hoover in that they didn't want to just hand out money to people, referred to as the dole. And so to support traditional values and individualism, the idea was that it was going to be better to give someone a job than to give someone a check. And at the height of the program, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration is going to provide work for over 20 million people. Now, the other signature piece of the first New Deal from a legislative point of view is the National Industrial Recovery Act that was signed into law on June 16, 1933. And we should take a harder look at this. The National Recovery Act set up programs to regulate industry. Section 7A granted rights to labor unions. And we can see how fast the mechanisms of government are moving right now under the Roosevelt administration. We have the Federal Emergency Relief Act, and on the same day, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration is set up. Now, the same is also true with the National Industrial Recovery Act. Just a few days later, the National Recovery Administration is going to be set up. The National Recovery Administration is going to set up fair trade rules by industry associations in over 600 industries, large and small, from corporations in coal to pet food manufacture. Now, the larger businesses in each of the distinct industries usually dominated these industry associations. So the National Recovery Administration can be criticized for entrenching power. And there's also a public relations component to the National Recovery Administration. A business that was part of the NRA could put the NRA sticker in the window of their business so that individuals would know that this was a organization that was trying to do the good thing insofar as following fair trade rules in wages and such. On May 12, 1933, Congress passes the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which establishes an agency to pay farmers not to grow crops in order to curb supply. Now, that sounds rather counterintuitive. At a time where there are people starving in the cities, there's too much production of agricultural products and the prices are too low. So in order to combat this, the government is going to pay farmers subsidies not to grow or cut production of 7 major commodities: wheat, cotton, corn, hogs, rice, tobacco, and dairy products. And policymakers would hope that farm prices would rise as production fell. Now, the Agricultural Adjustment Act is one of the key pieces of the New Deal which motivated African Americans to switch party allegiance from the Republicans to the Democratic Party. However, most of the African American farmers in the South that were hoping to benefit from these types of programs were sharecroppers. And as sharecroppers, they didn't own the land. They basically rented it. So what a larger farm owner would do is he would cancel the contracts of the tenants and the sharecroppers and leave those parts of his farm fallow and receive a cash subsidies. So the sharecroppers and tenant farmers wound up being evicted from the land. So it was even worse after the Agricultural Adjustment Act. But the Roosevelt administration should at least be giving the benefit of trying. There were some unintended consequences as a result of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the NRA created fair trade industry associations that wound up being dominated by the bigger businesses. Overall, the AAA and the NRA, they were designed to rescue the nation's productive industries and stabilize the economy. They did that to some extent, but overall they did little to end the Depression. May 18th, 1933 will see the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and this is a major public works program that the federal government is going to take on to build dams across the Tennessee River to improve river navigation and create electricity for the area's rural residents. This was an economically backward section of the country. There was no economic incentive for any business to lay down electrical lines or telephone lines. And because there was no business imperative to move into this sector because it didn't seem like there was going to be enough money generated from the investment, the only institution in society that could take on a project of this magnitude would be the government, moreover the federal government. So this is basically the 1928 Hoover Dam idea, but just taken to a much larger degree. We can see the number of dams that are going to be built in this multi-state area to bring flood control, electricity, and irrigation work. The Tennessee Valley Authority will be considered one of the New Deal's successes and lasting legacy. Last lecture, we examined the Depression era from a urban lens. Well, what's going on in rural America at the same time? Rural America is facing overproduction and low revenues as a result of that overproduction. Agriculture was not left behind in the technological wave with all these new time-saving devices. Mechanization in the form of tractors and other labor-saving devices is going to create a revolution in agricultural technology, and it's going to lead to overproduction. When the Depression hit, all this overproduction that seemed to be a boon turned out to be a bane because there was just falling prices for the agricultural goods. And then there's going to be extreme poverty that will be intensified by a massive drought and a series of severe dust storms called the Dust Bowls that we'll examine a little bit further on in the lecture. But it's going to prompt an exodus of people from Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, and Oklahoma. And as a result of the mass exodus of all peoples from this area, we're going to see Mexican repatriation during the Depression era as well in the West. Numbers go from 400,000 to 1 million Mexican and Mexican Americans were deported. Now, the Dust Bowl was an economic and environmental disaster brought about by, as we talked about, overproduction and also monocrops. Just growing one type of crop on all of your fields. Some crops, however, absorb a lot of nutrients from the soil. Others are soil nutrient neutral, and other crops still provide nutrients for the soil. The real problem was with monocrops that absorb more nutrients from the soil. Year after year, field after field, with no crop rotation or leaving any fields fallow, these crops just start to suck all the nutrients out of the soil, and then the soil became desiccated husks of its former self, and a stiff breeze would just send it flying into the air. Moreover, every ecosystem has a balance to it. And what happened was, in order to maximize the amount of yields in the Midwest farms, many of the native grasses were pulled up so that we could lay out more wheat. Well, the grasses that grew natively, they were designed to live in harmony with their ecosystem, and as such had the type of roots necessary so that the soil wouldn't erode around them, whereas wheat is just an invasive species and doesn't have the same type of balance with its environment. So a stiff wind would blow in and all the soil would just blow away. And so all throughout the Depression era in the early 1930s, there are these violent dust storms that are so thick that you can't fly airplanes, and it just covers an entire community. And you can't live like this day after day with these types of dust storms blowing in. And so that's where we see the importance of the Civilian Conservation Corps that Roosevelt had set up with executive order. Soil conservation and protecting against soil erosion by planting trees and working on irrigation and range management. So the Civilian Conservation Corps, it's young men typically, and they were going to be working away from home. There would be a CCC camp that would be set up in whatever area it was where their mandate for conservation work was located, and they were going to receive $30 a month, with most of that money required to be sent home to their families. And there's a lot of good works that were done in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Over 50,000 men learned how to read, and let this number sink in. 3 billion trees planted in 9 years. But unfortunately, the CCC, that wasn't enough to help the individuals that were experiencing the Dust Bowl itself. And these individuals would be called Okie. Oklahoma is going to be one of the states that's hardest hit during the Dust Bowl. These would be poor whites and sharecroppers, evicted from their lands, sometimes because of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, others because of the Dust Bowl, and they begin that manifest destiny tale that we discussed, where they continue to move west in search of a better life. And it's this experience, the experience of individuals fleeing the dust, that would provide the creative material for John Steinbeck's 1939 Pulitzer Prize winning work, The Grapes of Wrath. And so what else is going on in the West? In the same vein as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, we will see the Taylor Grazing Act in June 28th of 1934, which will see the federal government begin to oversee grazing and land usage rights in the West, and the West to a much greater degree than it had before. The New Deal represented a massive increase in federal power, and there were many individuals in the country who were uncomfortable with Roosevelt's power grab for the federal government, particularly of the executive branch. Republicans are going to continue their standard mantra that periodic downturns were part of the business cycle, and we just had to wait this particularly pernicious pernicious downturn out. But there are going to be Democrats that are also going to fear and argue that Roosevelt's programs were increasing the power of the federal government too much and perhaps leading America towards socialism. And Roosevelt's critics on the left are going to decry the New Deal as simply status quo and reaffirming the status quo, not going far enough. We see in our political cartoon that here is this giant executive branch in the form of Roosevelt towering over this little cook called Congress. Basically, just give me more power. It's written on the inside of the bowl. And we have to put Roosevelt in his international context as well. People in the country were scared that he was becoming too autocratic and too powerful, just like what was happening in the countries in Europe. By the late 1920s, Benito Mussolini is already in power and is an autocrat, and he is going to be the standard that other autocrats in Europe are going to model themselves after as well, particularly Hitler and Francisco Franco, these strongmen rulers of Europe that are going to be quite dangerous. There is this fear here in this country that Roosevelt is following in that line, just like Benito Mussolini, of an autocratic executive. Now, the most vociferous critics, at least those that history remembers, are the ones that, just like Roosevelt and his fireside chats, were the most effective in engaging the country with radio. Huey Long is going to be a populist governor from Louisiana who Roosevelt himself said was the most dangerous man in America. He's a senator in 1935, and he's going to say share the wealth. He's going to talk stridently about poverty and class tensions, and people are going to start to think that there's going to be class warfare in the country. And Huey Long is going to be one of these politicians that's to the left of Roosevelt, saying that it didn't go far enough. And he was getting ready to challenge Roosevelt for the presidency in 1936. He was, however, assassinated. Father Coughlin is going to have enormous influence in the Midwest. He's going to be a Catholic priest that will have a radio show that on certain nights could reach 45 million, almost as much as the president could. And he was for the New Deal until he was against it. He was an anti-Semite, and so he started to praise Hitler more and more as the 1930s went on, and thought that international banking was the main reason why the Depression happened, and didn't see it as something that was just a coincidence, but more nefarious, that there were individuals pulling the strings on the international system. And Father Coughlin, in doing so, he's speaking in code. This idea that Jews are synonymous with the international banking system. Other critics of the first New Deal would be, of course, the Communist Party. The Communist Party is making inroads, particularly with African American sharecroppers, who thought that the Agricultural Adjustment Act was going to work well for them, but it wound up not working well for them. Upton Sinclair, he was the writer of The Jungle from the Progressive era. He is going to run for governor of California on a socialist platform called End Poverty in California, where he wanted to take factories that were closed down, claim them by the state, and turn them into worker cooperatives. Now, all the legislation that Roosevelt and Congress were able to pass during the first 100 days of his administration was impressive. And of course, there were going to be individuals on the political right and the political left who would be unhappy with any piece of legislation. There invariably always are. But Roosevelt was a savvy political operative, and he knew how to outmaneuver most political opponents. However, the one critic of the first New Deal that Roosevelt was not able to outmaneuver was the judicial branch, the institution that's missing from the political cartoon that we viewed earlier, with Roosevelt as the giant and Congress as the midget. By 1935, the appeals process had brought these key pieces of the New Deal in front of the Supreme Court. Roosevelt is a new president. He has had no picks on the Supreme Court, and Democrats since Reconstruction have not been the norm insofar as the presidency is concerned. And so there wasn't many Supreme Court justices picked by Democrats. And in two key decisions, Sector Poultry Group versus the United States in May of 1935 and Butler versus the United States in January of 1936, conservative justices on the Supreme Court strike down both the National Industrial Relations Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the signature pieces of New Deal legislation that Roosevelt had passed for combating the Great Depression in both urbanized and rural areas of the United States. In the Schechter Poultry Court case, the Supreme Court is going to unanimously decide that the legislative branch is just giving up too much of its power to the executive, that political cartoon really is the reality, that Congress needs to make sure that it doesn't hand the executive branch too much power. Now, during the time it took for these court cases to eventually work their way up to the Supreme Court, the Roosevelt administration was not idle. Roosevelt was pursuing a second New Deal. He thought that relief and recovery were covered, and so he had moved on to the reform part. And it was a major reform of U.S. society that Roosevelt had in mind with the creation of a modern welfare state that we'll look at next lecture. But now everything from the first New Deal now into the second New Deal that Roosevelt had worked on seemed in jeopardy.